3 surprising signs you have imposter syndrome. In this presentation, I'm going to tell you a few things about yourself. Maybe I shouldn't call my shot that hard, but given the subject matter, it's easy to be confident. The matter at hand is imposter syndrome, one of the most common psychological issues facing modern humans. Today, we're going to be looking at 3 symptoms of imposter syndrome that you might not know are symptoms of it. So strap in because we're about to get so psychological. 1. Overachieving. This is an interesting one, but I found that it was an important sign to start with if we're going to have a conversation about imposter syndrome. It is important because while most sufferers of imposter syndrome are overachievers, most of them do not at all feel like they are overachievers. In fact, many overachievers are overachievers out of a constant fear that they are or can become underachievers. This is a pretty big disconnect. How can you be one way but think of yourself as the opposite way? Well, that is the essence of imposter syndrome. Overachieving can be a sign of imposter syndrome because by its very definition, it indicates a level of effort and sought-out success that is more than necessary. If you're doing as much as you need to do in order to survive and make yourself happy, that is one thing. But if you find that you're constantly pushing yourself to do more, to be more, to make more, then you are either suffering from imposter syndrome or vulnerable to it. 2. Down-talking yourself. This one is going to come off as less of a surprise than the previous one, because if you see someone or are someone who insults themselves, you probably know that something is wrong here. Down-talking yourself can come out in a number of ways. If you have trouble taking credit for things that you've done, this is down-talking yourself. If you accentuate your mistakes above your flashes of genius, that is also down-talking yourself. When I've talked to people that make a habit of down-talking themselves, they usually tell me that they feel obligated to do it. They say, "How will I learn to not make mistakes if I don't punish myself for my mistakes?" But that's not how success works. Mistakes don't become less common just because there's a punishment associated with them. They just become more stressful. 3. Not taking responsibility. Imposter syndrome is, in essence, an expression of low self-esteem. And when low self-esteem people see a bad thing, they immediately identify with it. They tell themselves, and sometimes others, "Yes, I am that bad thing." Conversely, they also say that they are not good things. The problem is their idea of what is good and what is bad is warped. People with imposter syndrome will say they are not overachievers because they think being an overachiever is good. They'll say they don't take responsibility because that is bad. And it is bad, but not in the way a sufferer of imposter syndrome thinks it is. Failing to take responsibility means inaccurately assessing your own mistakes. What not everyone realizes, though, is that this works in 2 directions. You can either fail to admit that you've made a mistake, or you can treat a mistake like it is an unforgivable sin. Both are equally inaccurate. In essence, fighting your own imposter syndrome is about being kind to yourself. Be patient with your mistakes. Be reasonable about your goals, and you will slowly find it easier to appreciate what you have accomplished. 3 ways imposter syndrome can impact your career. In this presentation, I'm going to be showing you something that you hopefully already know. Imposter syndrome can have a few negative impacts on your career. Not everyone agrees with that assessment, however. These days, there is a cultural acceptance of the brooding, success-driven individual who bullies themselves to accomplish great things. Imposter syndrome is, as its name applies, an affliction. And if you have any doubts to that effect, then I have prepared for you a list of 3 ways imposter syndrome can impact your career. 1. It makes downtime into a high-stakes struggle. One of the defining symptoms of imposter syndrome is the repeated urge to always be working. This is pervasive in American culture, where extractive capitalism has convinced many people that the only way to live is to maximize efficiency and constantly increase one's value in the economy. Few things will convince a person that this is not true, but that is not what I am trying to do. All I'm trying to point out is the obvious drawback. If you value work over all else, up to and including your own pleasure, safety, and health, then it will be impossible to relax. Sufferers of imposter syndrome feel as though if they are not always working, then how can they call themselves productive? There will eventually be times when they're sleeping, or eating, or bathing, or spending time with their children. Aren't they stealing from the economy when they're doing those things? This viewpoint presumes that all your worth belongs to the economy to begin with, and you have to justify your existence by working to pay off that invisible debt. This line of thinking will impact your career by turning it into a tide that slowly withers you away. 2. Socializing becomes difficult. It is hard to socialize when you have imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is usually the result of a person treating their self-worth as the domain of some cold, unsympathetic future version of themselves that knows neither pity nor patience. For a person with imposter syndrome to socialize, they have to quiet that voice. This is already bad enough, but the worst part is that many sufferers of imposter syndrome think their problems could be solved if only they could become that future version of themselves. And the thing is, living constantly in fear of your own self-criticism is already going to make socializing hard. But were you to actually become the all-powerful god of productivity you imagine you could be if you just buckled down and worked harder, then you would likely become a jerk in the process. Since the defining feature of that future self is their impatience, becoming that person will not make you more patient. 3. Intimacy becomes impossible. This is perhaps the most crippling aspect of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome has you constantly looking elsewhere for worth. It has you looking to productivity, to the future, to everywhere but where you are. How can you be close to someone if you can't be close to them? If you are constantly looking elsewhere, how can you be anywhere? How does this factor into your career? Well, if you're reading this, then I have news for you. You are a person. I don't mean to alarm you, but facts are facts. And people need intimacy. Not just with other people either. People need intimacy with their work, with their living space, with themselves. If you drift through life hoping for the future to deliver you happiness, you'll miss the happiness around you. 5 different types of imposter syndrome. In this presentation, I will be showing you a few fine details of imposter syndrome that you might not know about. Imposter syndrome is a complex affliction with a wide variety of ways that it can be expressed. It is not officially recognized by the Diagnostic Service Manual of Mental Diseases, but it has been studied extensively by psychological researchers. So let's take a look at the 5 different types of imposter syndrome. 1. The gifted kid. This is an expression of imposter syndrome usually found in young adults. As many people born in the 90s can attest, there was a tendency in public schools to esteem certain children who scored high on standardized tests. They would be placed in gifted programs, be given extra responsibilities, and so on. The real world does not have gifted programs, however. Going from being recognized as the smartest of the smart in high school and perhaps even college to merely being another worker bee in a hive of worker bees, many gifted kids will feel that they actually aren't qualified to do anything. They grew accustomed to a certain pattern. Validation means they're doing well. No validation means they're doing poorly. And since the world outside of high school does not validate good work with anything more than a paycheck, it can be hard for these former gifted kids to feel like they belong anywhere. 2. The lone wolf. This sufferer of imposter syndrome is likely a product of a toxic environment. For one reason or another, they got the impression that asking for help, or receiving help without asking for it, is somehow dishonest. The result is a person that has trouble feeling comfortable in groups, even if they work well in the group. The defining trait of this type of imposter syndrome is not external antisocial behavior, but rather an internal discomfort with collaboration. 3. The overachiever. This is perhaps the most common way imposter syndrome expresses itself. This form of the affliction has the sufferer trying to do more than everyone else, staying late for work, taking on too many projects, anything they can do to show the world that they are the hard worker they want to be. This issue is that while they are in reality pushing their body and time to its limits. They believe that they are behaving normally. They cannot imagine doing anything less than what they are doing. When your identity is so inexorably tied to your work, as the overachievers is, not working is tantamount to not existing. 4. The perfectionist. Perfectionism is the sister syndrome of imposter syndrome. This expression of imposter syndrome is a result of a person feeling inadequate if they present themselves as anything less than perfect. It's not enough for them to be the best. They must be infallible. The core issue here is obviously that no one is infallible. Perfectionists usually come from environments where any flaw is seen as unacceptable. But in healthy environments, trying to seem perfect will do a lot more to undermine your credibility than any amount of vulnerability. 5. The know-it-all. This version of imposter syndrome garners the least sympathy, but it is an affliction all the same, and they who suffer it are suffering all the same. The know-it-all gauges their worth based on how much they can know. This includes how much they can correct others, interject in conversations, and in general flaunt their knowledge. The know-it-all will find it hard for themselves to approach or talk to anyone, as saying things like, "I don't know," will make them feel like they're opening themselves up to attack and discreditation. In the end, imposter syndrome is a product of the sufferer's environment. They are never just a jerk that needs to be put down, but a person that needs to be helped. So whether you are suffering from one of these yourself or know someone who is, be patient with them. In this presentation, we're going to look at one of the modern world's biggest illusions: failure. What does it mean to fail? Is it when you're asked a question and you give the wrong answer? Is it when you have an assignment but don't complete it properly or on time? In both those cases, you can always try again, so long as you are allowed. How true is failure if it's not absolute? These questions are what make dealing with failure difficult. So here are 5 tips for handling your failures so as not to be overwhelmed by them. 1. Use the failure as a jumping off point. This is the easiest thing to do in response to failure. In fact, it can basically become instinctual. The habit you will want to develop is looking for how you can improve as a result of the failure. Keep in mind, this does not always mean obsessively analyzing why you failed. That can drive you crazy. It just means using the failure as a way of stimulating improvement. The improvement does not even need to be related to the failure. In fact, it can be better if it is not related at all. What you want to do is rebound from your failure by putting positive energy into yourself. 2. Looking for the lesson. This tip is similar to the last one. But whereas the previous tip focused on directing your energy away from the problems that caused the failure, this tip is all about the opposite. There is a natural risk in preoccupying yourself with how to prevent future failures. You don't want to live in fear of the future, always analyzing your past and present actions to keep from making mistakes. But it is possible, sometimes necessary, to look at what you did and ask how you could do better. The advantage to this is that it seizes control of the failure. By taking responsibility for it, you give yourself control over what happens next. The failure is no longer an inanimate blemish on your life, but a question that you get to answer. Will you learn from it or not? 3. Plan your future with failure in mind. Overachievers hate this advice, but whether you're doing it in advance of failure or immediately after, it will help you to deal with the inevitable. Everyone fails. Everyone makes mistakes. Some are big, some are small, but they are as certain as the tides, so plan around them. Imagine your road to success as a multi-step process. It does not matter how many steps there are, as long as failure is one of them. Accepting your failures as inevitable will make them far less ugly. It will make them part of the cost of doing business. 4. Let yourself feel your feelings. This advice is not going to apply to everyone, because some people are highly skilled at feeling and processing their feelings in healthy ways. Other people will feel ashamed, however, of even the most natural of emotional responses. They will not only feel ashamed for failing, but feel ashamed for feeling ashamed. For this kind of person, feeling their feelings free of shame can be difficult, so it is critical to do so. 5. Start something new. The most common mistake in dealing with failure is getting fixated on it. If you try the same thing over and over again, you will lessen yourself. The best way to move on is to move on. Go to a new project, a new opportunity, a new chance to feel like a winner. And listen, a big thing I want to communicate here is that failing doesn't make you a loser, but it can make you feel like one. Just know that no failure is permanent. You can always pick yourself up and try again. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at something that not everybody needs, but everybody wants. How to improve your self-confidence in the workplace. The funny thing about confidence is that even if you have enough, it can always feel like you need more. Maybe you had a terrible day at the office where you could have said something clever but didn't speak up. Or maybe you crushed it today and are just looking to make sure you crush it tomorrow. In either case, you still want to know how to go to work the next day grabbing the bull by the horns. Well, I'm here to tell you 5 ways you can do that. 1. Dress up. This is such a simple tip that some people barely consider it advice. The response I'll usually hear is, "What will dressing up do for me?" Or, "But I've dressed up before and no one noticed." The goal, however, is not to get other people to notice you. It is to get you to notice you. Dressing nice is a confidence booster because it will strengthen the line between you and other people. When you're the best dressed person in the building, you'll be able to see yourself as different in a good way. 2. Laugh at yourself. It is pretty easy to convince people that this advice works. It's a lot harder to convince people to actually do it. Laughing at yourself, or at least being able to laugh at yourself, is a critical component to being confident. To laugh at yourself is to say, "I don't mind that I make mistakes. I still find myself enjoyable to be around." This is not only an attractive quality to others, but develops a habit of not being irritated with yourself. 3. Know the power stances. People are complicated. We are both products and producers of chemical reactions. One of the chemicals involved in those chemical reactions is testosterone. This chemical is usually associated with manliness, but that is not a totally correct correlation. Testosterone is a chemical that inhibits empathy and cultivates blood flow. Essentially, it makes it easier to ignore your feelings as well as easier to act. Ignoring your own feelings is a big part of confidence, as your feelings can be a whirlwind of emotions, and sometimes it's better to cool those feelings off. The funny thing is that you can actually trigger testosterone production in your body with certain postures. The classic Superman-looking hands on the hips with your chest puffed out posture will trigger testosterone production in your body. 4. Think of yourself less. C.S. Lewis once said, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less." Self-confidence is crippled by thinking too frequently or too deeply about your own self. Whether you are admiring yourself or criticizing yourself, both are expressions of the kind of vanity that can eventually turn toxic. If you can bring yourself to instead admire the world around you, what you'll find is that doing so develops a habit of positivity that at the same time keeps you from indulging in hurtful self-criticism. 5. Ask others for help. This is the hardest advice for self-confidence of all. To begin with, it's hard to believe that making yourself vulnerable will result in confidence. But it will. And the reason for that is because once you open yourself up and find that you were allowed to be more vulnerable than you thought, you'll feel more comfortable doing it again. Self-confidence means not being afraid, and if you're afraid to ask for help, then you aren't really that confident. Confidence in the workplace can be highly reliant on your environment. If your workplace is toxic, focus on keeping yourself safe first. But if you can find the time, then building yourself up is always worth it. In this presentation, I'm going to hit you with the most concise, rapid-fire tips for battling imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is a miserable affliction that will drain your brain and play with your emotions. But it is not unbeatable, and with these 10 tips, I plan to show you how to conquer it. 1. Plan your success. Imposter syndrome is an irrational thought process. The best way to rewire your brain to ignore that irrationality is to fight it with rationality. Remind yourself what success looks like, and you will be forced to acknowledge when you achieve it. The big thing here is focusing on what is real. Imposter syndrome will try to trick you into believing you're fake. Don't let it. If reality is telling you that you are legit, believe it. 2. Admire your failures. It takes a lot of guts to fail. If you're doing something that doesn't risk failure, then you aren't doing something very challenging. This is easier said than done, but saying it can be an easy way to start doing it. Remind yourself that failure is good. Failure is growth. Failure reminds you what is real and what is fake. 3. Recognize real lies. The other side of the coin from the last tip is that real lies do exist. You probably aren't as fraudulent as you think you are, but there are frauds out there. Look for them, then look for the differences between you and them. You'll find that there are more differences than you think. 4. Catch yourself slipping. Imposter syndrome gets worse when you go into the negative thought spirals that cultivate it. But these thought spirals have to start somewhere. Start by thinking about when the last time you thought of yourself as a fraud. When did that event start? Why did it start? When it happens again, walk yourself through your thought process. Eventually, you'll be able to see it as it's happening. Then you may even be able to see it before it starts. 5. Be humble. The problem with imposter syndrome is that it makes you think that you are being humble. But as C.S. Lewis said, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's all about thinking of yourself less. What you need is to stop thinking about how fraudulent you feel. But that doesn't mean you need to focus on thinking about yourself differently. You just need to take your mind off yourself for a bit. 6. Find a mentor. Whether it is a real-life mentor or the advice of an online guru, if you find someone that you can recognize as real and emulate them, then it will help you feel more real yourself. 7. Seek out new opportunities. This will keep you from getting bogged down in a narrow sense of identity. Imposter syndrome is both cultivated by and cultivates within a sense of being limited. Combat this by consciously expanding your horizons. 8. Challenge your perfectionism. Perfectionism is one of the most common forms of imposter syndrome. It tells you, I can't be legitimate because I'm not performing optimally. The thing is, nobody performs optimally. Seek out people you instinctively recognize as legitimate and find their flaws. This may sound petty, but remind yourself that nobody is perfect, and you'll feel more at ease about your own flaws. 9. Say your name. This is one of the strangest tricks out there, but saying your name aloud will release chemicals commonly associated with confidence. I am awesome works, but your name is awesome is better. 10. Stop thinking. Start doing. If you're suffering from imposter syndrome, nothing is going to change if you're just stewing in your own anxiety. Some of the tips on this list might sound strange, but they all have something in common. There are no mental gymnastics you can do to fight mental gymnastics. Fight the good fight. Remember your worth, and good luck out there. How imposter syndrome is holding you back in your career. In this presentation, we're going to be looking at one of the most pervasive forms of self-doubt in the world today. I am talking, of course, about imposter syndrome. I'd like to shine a light on what imposter syndrome is, as well as a few of the ways it can hold you back in your career. First coined in the 1970s by psychologists Susan Imes and Pauline Clance, imposter syndrome's defining traits are a fundamental belief in one's own qualifications for being where they are. The sufferer of imposter syndrome will have a definition of success, a criterion of worthiness for their own station in life, which they do not fulfill. This is absurd, obviously, since if they did not fulfill the requirements for their station in life, then they would not hold their station in life. This is a pretty big incongruency between perception and reality. Thinking about the world should work one way when it, in fact, works in a different way is not healthy thinking. Usually, people develop this line of thinking in a way which is beneficial to them. I shouldn't have gotten rejected, they think. I am deserving of acceptance, and my rejection is evidence that the world is wrong. People with imposter syndrome have it the other way around. They think, I shouldn't have been accepted. I am deserving of rejection, and my acceptance is evidence that the world is wrong. Both statements have a few things in common. For one, they're both highly preoccupied with that one deserves. They both appeal to some invisible judge, and they both assume to know the metrics by which this invisible judge metes out all their rulings. This kind of thinking holds you back so much. To begin with, making a habit out of weighing what you deserve will go one of two ways. Either you will decree yourself deserving of too much or too little. Imagine you find $20 in an elevator, and then you immediately ask yourself, do I deserve this? The very act of asking the question poisons the situation because it forces you to say that you either deserve more or less than what you have. It's a habit that will lead you to eternal dissatisfaction as it causes you to always be looking somewhere else for your satisfaction than where you are. Another way imposter syndrome holds you back is in the esteem you cultivate, both in yourself and in others. One big symptom of imposter syndrome is vocal self-critique, wherein the sufferer gives themselves a hard time for making mistakes or missing opportunities. If people see you as someone who self-critiques often, they're going to be unenthusiastic about working with you. It does not matter if your self-critique is well-founded or articulate. People are going to be afraid of what happens if and when you finally turn that criticism onto others. The last way imposter syndrome holds you back is in the mentality it fosters. What would a sufferer of imposter syndrome get if they finally made it? If they finally got where they wanted to be and felt like they earned it? I do not think it would make them more kind. In fact, I think it would turn them cruel. Sufferers of imposter syndrome believe themselves to be inferior to their ideal selves. They allow themselves to be debased and punished by this ghost of Christmas future that they imagine as holding the final word on their self-worth. Would that image of superior be kinder if it actually existed, or would it be crueler? Imposter syndrome is never a reasonable response to your situation. It won't be easy, but you have to do away with it soon, or it will soon do away with you. In this presentation, we're going to be taking a look at one of the most contemporary of feelings, self-doubt in the workplace. Doubting yourself has existed long before the modern conception of what it meant to work. After all, Lord Byron waxed poetical about self-doubt, and he never worked a day in his life. But doubting yourself in the workplace is a much different experience than doubting yourself in, say, a sports game, a family gathering, or a martial arts class. In those classes, you will almost always get finite responses to your doubts. Can you throw the touchdown pass? Do you have food stuck in your teeth? Can you win this fight? In all of those cases, it is possible for a positive outcome to emerge from even the most crippling of anxieties. But modern workplaces are unique from those scenarios, where sports or social interactions or physical altercations might come down to a decisive moment. The workplace is a battlefield of attrition. Nothing happens fast at a workplace. In fact, it can be hard to tell if anything is happening at all. Postmodern philosophy calls this feeling ennui. That is the feeling that we are not the main character of the story. If you go off to work for Google or Amazon, you will almost certainly feel this way. How can you be certain of yourself when you are clearly a replaceable cog in a machine? That degree of self-doubt can be crippling. People were not meant to function as such small parts of such large machines, so it is no wonder that we begin to scrutinize ourselves negatively. Once we recognize that this is a problem, though, what do we do about it? How do we break the cycle? If you're struggling with doubting yourself in the workplace, whether you're doubting your ability to do your job or doubting your ability to have a life outside of your job, the starting point is the same no matter what. You first have to establish your value outside of the workplace. To a degree, this might sound unintuitive. It sounds kind of like I'm asking you to cure your cancer by going for a morning jog every day. What is the connecting tissue? How does one relate to the other? Well, remember that I emphasized that this is a first step. No matter what your second step to feeling more confident is, perceiving yourself as valuable outside of what you do has to be the first. In the times of ancient Greece, Aristotle defined virtue as the product of one's habits. Essentially, your goodness comes from what you do. This is such a natural way of looking at the world, and it can certainly be applied to ethics and morality. But you cannot judge yourself by the same metrics. If you only judge yourself as worthy for what you accomplish, especially in a soul-sucking modern workplace, then you will always doubt yourself. The modern world simply does not allow you to take full possession of your work, and as a result, defining yourself by your work is laying a trap for your own self-esteem. If your work is not necessary, then there is little difference between your value and the value of someone who's a lazy bum. And if you cannot tell the difference in value between those things, then you will suffer. Breaking the cycle of self-doubt starts by treating yourself as valuable by default. There need not be a reason. There need not be an explanation. You are valuable. You deserve to exist, no matter what your work says. In this presentation, we will be examining the link between the mental affliction known as imposter syndrome and one's own self-confidence. Imposter syndrome is a pattern of thinking that usually involves one very specific emotion, the feeling that you do not deserve to be, have, or become what you are. There are a few big ways and a few small ways that this emotion relates to one's ideas of self-worth and displays of self-confidence. Feeling like you don't deserve to be where you are is just the conclusion imposter syndrome brings you to. There are a lot of things you have to convince yourself of to arrive at that point. To begin with, imagine a design meeting at any large tech firm. Design is a good field of expertise to use as an example, because even if you're not qualified to have an expert theory on design, everyone is qualified to have at least some kind of opinion on the subject. If you found yourself in one such meeting and were asked your opinion on a design element, whether or not you answered would be heavily dependent on your self-confidence. Even if you have an education on the subject, you're not going to be able to speak in front of people unless you feel you have something to say. And that is the most immediate way by which imposter syndrome cripples you. If you believe that you do not even deserve to be in that meeting, that you secretly know nothing about design, that to ask your opinion on the subject of the meeting would be to sabotage the whole thing, well then, it doesn't really matter whether you have an expert opinion or not. You'll convince yourself to stay quiet. This is a big, obvious way imposter syndrome affects your self-confidence. But what is a smaller way? What about a way that you might not notice? For the last example, I suggested imagining being in a meeting. That is because the biggest, most obvious downside of imposter syndrome come out when you are immediately faced with a situation. The smaller downsides, however, come out in idleness, when you are alone. I'm going to ask a difficult question. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. It's not about how you answer. It's about how you feel about giving an answer or not. Here's the question. What is the worst thing you've done due to your imposter syndrome? Have you lied, skipped or delayed eating dinner, stayed late at work and missed hanging out with friends? And how do you feel about making these choices? About prioritizing work over these things? You do not need to overthink the meaning of your answers to these questions. The most meaningful thing about answering the question, what is the worst thing you've done due to your imposter syndrome, is whether or not there is a worst thing. No matter how tame or how bad it is, If there is anything that you consider a worse thing, then that means it is a bad thing. It is a thing for which you feel shame, and shame will crush your self-confidence. If your imposter syndrome has you taking actions you are ashamed of, then your imposter syndrome is slowly, silently weathering away at your confidence. Like termites eating away at a treehouse, you won't feel things getting weaker immediately, but when they will go all at once. Imposter syndrome is its own affliction, but it is also a sign of depression. If you're worried that the problem is becoming serious, seek help. Don't let yourself be caught in a downward spiral. What is imposter syndrome, plus 3 ways to fight it at work? Modern life has taken humankind so far from our natural habitat that imposter syndrome has become commonplace. But what exactly is imposter syndrome? Psychologists Susan Imes and Pauline Clance first discovered the phenomenon in the 70s. They focused in on imposter syndrome as it presented itself in overachievers. When you are preoccupied with doing or producing great things, it can be hard to recognize those things as your own. People suffering from imposter syndrome will often find themselves questioning their ownership over their own work. They might ask, how much of that was my doing? Am I really responsible for that? Even when a project could not have existed without them. This strange psychological phenomenon is a product of our world's ever-growing self-awareness. We are more cognizant than ever of what humans are capable of. It can feel wrong to relax when our potential is so great. Yet at the same time, that pressure creates insecurity. No matter what you do, you find yourself asking, did I really get here on my own? But if you spend your free time or even your work time hounding yourself over proof of your validity, you will drive yourself crazy. To that end, here are 3 ways to handle imposter syndrome at work. 1. Define your own success. A big part of what makes imposter syndrome so common is that the very concept of success is unnatural. That is not to say that it is inherently right or wrong, only that it's developed by people and it has to be learned. But it is entirely possible that you learn a toxic definition of success. If you think of success as taking ownership of all the money in the world, for instance, then you're setting yourself up to feel like a failure. To readdress this, you need to think critically about your own definition of what it means to be successful. Move the goalpost to something that you can do, and you will feel more ownership over your success. 2. Talk to someone. The thing about imposter syndrome is that it is an affliction based on shame. You feel like you've been disproportionately rewarded for your actual efforts. It can be scary to imagine mentioning this to anyone, as to do so would be to reveal your own unbelonging. What you will probably find, however, is that if you talk to someone about your feelings, you'll discover just how ridiculous your worries are. Talk to someone you trust, someone you look up to. If your mentor, who you view as successful, views you as capable, then who are you to argue with them? 3. Examine your failures. This will be the most difficult thing on this list, but it is worth it. Examining your failures does not just mean flogging yourself for your shortcomings. It means taking responsibility for what you've done. The thing is, you can't take responsibility for your failures without taking responsibility for your successes as well. This works the other way around too. No one fails unless they're trying to accomplish something, and no one can say they are trying to accomplish something without there being a risk of failure. Admit to yourself that you failed and realize that it is okay to fail. None of these will have you waking up in the morning and feeling like a winner, but that is not the goal here. You're not trying to feel like a born winner. You're just trying to feel like yourself, because that's enough.